Chapter 1, Our Enemy, the World. The world today is in an incredible state of flux and change. Traditional views and values have been altered and almost reversed within a relatively short time. Under the numbing influence of television and the highly mobile electronic media, minds have been manipulated, thought patterns set up, and decisions dictated. And most of the millions so influenced are almost oblivious to the powerful artificial agencies which were used to change their minds and their morals. There is no question whatsoever that Satan is pulling the strings and directing the subtle forces which are designed to destroy us spiritually. Under the hypnotizing influence of these forces, Christian minds have been just as successfully brainwashed as those of the most unregenerate sinner. Our only safety is to recognize the clever camouflages of the enemy. 1,000 disguised death traps have been planted all around us. Almost imperceptibly, our thinking has been affected by what we see and hear. Spiritual convictions have softened and disappeared altogether. The fine sensitivity to sin has been blunted by incessant exposure to the apparent innocent influences of our baited society. In the Scriptures, these assault weapons of Satan are referred to simply as the world. And no one can say that we've not been warned against their demoralizing effect. Paul, James, and John all wrote with dramatic urgency about the dangers of collaborating with the world. Notice these texts in 1 John 2:15 and 16. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. Again, James 4, verse 4. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. And John 15:19. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. 2 Corinthians 6:17. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. Titus 2:14. Who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity, and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Now these writers had an inspired obsession to expose the deadly error of mingling together the sacred and profane. They're saying to us with one voice, don't love the world, you're not of the world. Come out of the world and be a peculiar and separated people. These texts are not to be construed as orders to leave the physical occupation of the world, of course. Obviously, they're warning against certain influences, customs, and ideas which would be highly detrimental to the Christian way of life. Furthermore, Jesus himself indicated that things of the world would appear completely innocent in the eyes of men. He laid down an eternal principle when he spoke these words to the Pharisees in Luke 16:15. For that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. Now you study that statement carefully, friends. Christ is saying that the most honored, respected things in society will be the greatest enemy of the truth. He's saying that his people would have to stand on the opposite side from the prevailing practices of the world. True Christians will have to reject the lifestyle which will be the accepted, approved norm for all the rest of the world. Do we have any idea what is involved in taking such a position? It's not easy to stand against the sincere, articulate opinion of popular national figures. And then there will be full support from the great church systems to give even more credence to the things which are highly esteemed among men. This wrong way of life will be so patently taken for granted that any deviation will be looked upon as stupid and irrational. Ellen G. White explains it this way in Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 289. When we reach the standard that the Lord would have us reach, worldlings will regard Seventh-day Adventists as odd, singular, straight-laced extremists. End quote. Now this brings us to another most important question. What effect will all of these glamorized, disguised approaches have upon the remnant church? The studied purpose of our great enemy is to make sin appear unobjectionable and, if possible, to infiltrate the camp of the saints. The one great citadel of strength, The last bulwark of defense which stands against the lawless one is the seed of the woman. According to Revelation 12:17, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. You see, Satan hates the law of God. He hates the Sabbath. And he hates those who stand in the gap upholding the validity of that law. Down through the centuries, the devil has devised special weapons to use against the people of God. Those weapons have varied from generation to generation. Often, the sharp edge of persecution was turned against that little remnant who stood loyal to the commandments of God. Persecution and the death sentence will come into the picture again as a desperate devil unleashes the worst that he has against the true church. He knows this is the life or death encounter which will settle the issues of the great controversy for all eternity. This time, he will overlook no advantage. Relying upon the psychological expertise of 6,000 years' experience of trying to bend the human mind, he has initiated a softening up operational plan against the people he hates. That plan consists of gradually weakening the spiritual defenses of Seventh-day Adventists through worldly compromise. This will be the ultimate weapon which Satan has cleverly designed to undermine the faith of every member of the remnant church. How successful will it be? How many will be shaken out in the approaching crisis because they yielded to the things of the world? We don't have to wonder. The answer has been given over and over in the spirit of prophecy. It is a sickening answer, and we would like to believe it's not true. But read it for yourself and marvel. Listen to this statement in Volume 1, page 608. I would say that we are living in a most solemn time. And the last vision given me, I was shown the startling fact that but a small portion of those who now profess the truth will be sanctified by it and be saved. Many will get above the simplicity of the work. They will conform to the world, cherish idols, and become spiritually dead. End quote. How incredible that is, friends. The great majority of those who now rejoice in the truth will give up their faith and be lost. They will be lost because they, quote, conform to the world, end quote. That's what we just read. Satan's insidious, innocent-appearing, highly esteemed lifestyle will disarm them, weaken them, and finally destroy them. Another statement is even more specific. Volume 5, page 136. The great proportion of those who now appear genuine will prove to be base metal. So you see, the softening up strategy of the enemy is clearly described by Ellen G. White. Here's another statement now from Prophets and Kings, page 188. The time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The observance of the false Sabbath will be urged upon us. The contest will be between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. Those who have yielded step by step to worldly demands and conformed to worldly customs will then yield to the powers that be rather than subject themselves to derision, insult, threatened imprisonment, and death. At that time, the gold will be separated from the dross. True godliness will be clearly distinguished from the appearance and tinsel of it. Many a star that we have admired for its brilliance will then go out in darkness. Those who have assumed the ornaments of the sanctuary but are not clothed with Christ's righteousness will then appear in the shame of their own nakedness. End quote. Now don't miss the line which describes the reason for this mass apostasy. Quote, those who have yielded step by step to worldly demands and conformed to worldly customs will then yield to the powers that be. End quote. Isn't that astonishing, friends? Not only will the majority be shaken out of the church, they will actually turn against their former brethren and become bitter enemies of the truth. Now let's read another statement in Great Controversy, page 608. As the storm approaches, a large class who have professed faith in the third angel's message, but have not been sanctified through obedience to the truth, abandon their position and join the ranks of the opposition. By uniting with the world and partaking of its spirit, they have come to view matters in nearly the same light, and when the test is brought, they are prepared to choose the easy, popular side. Men of talent and pleasing address, who once rejoiced in the truth, employ their powers to deceive and mislead the souls. They become the most bitter enemies of their former brethren. When Sabbath keepers are brought before the courts to answer for their faith, These apostates are the most efficient agents for Satan to misrepresent and accuse them, and by false reports and insinuations to stir up the rulers against them." End quote. Again, we are fascinated by the expression, "by uniting with the world, they are prepared to choose the easy, popular side." Notice that it's a preparation work. Here again is revealed the fantastic psychological program of Satan to break down moral barriers. Worldly compromise, worldly conformity. That's the way it's going to be done. Another statement from Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 278. "The work which the church has failed to do in a time of peace and prosperity, she will have to do in a terrible crisis, under most discouraging, forbidding circumstances. The warnings that worldly conformity has silenced or withheld must be given under the fiercest opposition from enemies of the faith. And at that time, the superficial conservative class, whose influence has steadily retarded the progress of the work, will renounce the faith and take their stand with its avowed enemies, toward whom their sympathies have long been tending. These apostates will then manifest the most bitter enmity, doing all in their power to oppress and malign their former brethren and to excite indignation against them. This day is just before us." End quote. The words worldly conformity spring out at us again from this statement. Repeatedly, we've been warned about this massive attack of Satan through worldliness. Yet we hear so very little about this particular subject. Thousands of Seventh-day Adventists have been blinded to this operational plan of the evil one. Some of our people have been led to believe that it's legalistic to make any kind of issue over standards and lifestyles. To them, it's quibbling and judgmental. This is surely the way Satan would have them feel. They talk and think much about the final test over the true Sabbath, but fail to see how the outcome of the test is being determined right now. Says Ellen White in Testimonies, Volume 5, page 216, "Those who are uniting with the world are receiving the worldly mold and preparing for the mark of the beast. Those who are distrustful of self, who are humbling themselves before God and purifying their souls by obeying the truth, these are receiving the heavenly mold and preparing for the seal of God in their foreheads." End quote. The mark of the beast will be enforced. Every soul will have to go to the side of the true Sabbath or the counterfeit Sunday. Seventh-day Adventists will face the death sentence for their faith. And tragically, the majority will not be able to stand in that crisis. They will prove disloyal because of earlier compromise and vacillation over Christian standards. By yielding gradually to worldly custom and fashion, their strength of will and decision will be so diluted that they cannot endure the test. And this compromise is going on right now. This very moment, the great majority of our fellow church members are bending toward the world to such a degree that they'll be lost when the mark is enforced. Now here's the question that bothers me. Am I bending with them? How can I be sure that I'm not following the drift which will bring on the great shaking in the church? What cleverly disguised diabolical method has Satan employed to blind the eyes of so many of God's people that they will finally choose the world over the truth? It must surely be the polished masterpiece of all the deceptive plans he has ever used against the saints. The people who've been noted for their high standards will be tricked into yielding up their separated lifestyle. The average Adventist today would indignantly deny that he's being worldly. The majority of our members would express full assurance that they will not give up their faith, even in the face of death. Yet we have just read that they will. What does this mean? It means that most of our members are caught up in worldliness and don't even realize it. They're indulging in dangerous compromise and think it's perfectly innocent and acceptable. They've been so blinded that they cannot recognize the worldly things they're doing. Why can they not see their involvement with the world? Because the lowering of standards was so gradual that none realized what was happening. The devil's scheme is not to make the church suddenly abandon its historic position against the flesh and the world. He's far too clever to think that we'll make any public announcement that it's all right to go to movies, wear makeup and jewelry, or drink tea and coffee. But Satan knows how the mind operates under the power of suggestion and association. With infinite patience, he introduces pictures, words, ideas, and practices that cannot be condemned per se. In fact, many of Satan's innocent, quote, unquote, devices are not only highly esteemed among men, but have some commendable qualities and features. A perfect example of such a device is television. And how many of us have heard convincing arguments for the fine news, documentaries, and religious programming? No one can say that the TV console in the living room is an evil thing in itself. In fact, taken by itself, it's a fine piece of furniture and a source of good information. But then begins the masterful process of psychological assault in which Satan is unexcelled. Very slowly, the discriminations are dulled by glimpses and snatches of borderline comedy, violence, and so forth. The mind adjusts to the new level of input, and almost imperceptibly begins to tolerate the changing quality of sight and sound. Two inspired statements will help us see how the work of the enemy develops. From Selected Messages, Book 2, page 21, Satan will insinuate himself by little wedges which widen as they make a place for themselves. The specious devices of Satan will be brought into the special work of God at this time. Again, from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 718, the work of the enemy is not abrupt. It is a secret undermining of the strongholds of principles. It begins in apparently small things. End quote. How important it is to recognize the direction in which we're being led by any particular influence. The manner in which quail are often trapped provides a parallel to Satan's tactics. Wheat is placed several feet from the spot where a snare is triggered to spring shut on the quail. At first, the birds approach the good wheat with some obvious apprehension, but because there's no danger in view, their fears are allayed. The next day, the wheat is placed a bit nearer to the snare, and the birds are less wary of the scattered grain. Day after day, the wheat is placed just a little bit closer to the trap until the quail are completely confident that there's nothing dangerous about that fine wheat. Then, of course, the wheat is placed inside the snare, and the birds still come. Innocently, they trust the good food to remain good and a safe feast to remain safe. Then the trap is sprung. Now, I'm not contending that quail should stop eating wheat or that Christians should cease all good activities. The point is that we should be cautious enough to consider the direction in which we're being led and be willing to give up even the, quote, unquote, good things if they're taking us in a direction of spiritual danger. Can good things lead in a wrong direction? Indeed they can. Christians are led to give up their high standards by degrees, often by a completely innocent-looking process. This is the way compromise has always slipped into the church. Satan introduces an activity which is only slightly objectionable. In fact, it might be very hard to divine exactly why the action is not good. And because the deviation is so tiny, no one really wants to make an issue over it. Some faithful members of the church feel a bit uncomfortable about the matter, but are reluctant to say anything for fear of being called fanatical. They decide to wait until there's a larger issue before they take a strong stand. Unfortunately, there will never be a larger issue. The devil makes certain that all the steps of compromise are very small. He knows that hardly anyone would have the courage to make any sustained objection to the minute degree of digression. Once upon a time, the devil's favorite argument was, everybody else is doing it. Although the young people still use that one occasionally, a new term is currently being tossed about to justify worldly conformity. A little bit is all right. You see, the dress is just a little bit too short. The drink contains only a little bit of caffeine. The TV program shows only a little bit of violence. The wedding ring is only a small one, and the cosmetics add just a little bit of color. We could go on and on, of course. We can't seem to learn the lesson of Lot as he left Sodom. Most of his family had refused to leave the doomed city, you remember? He had lost everything he owned by choosing to live in that wicked environment, his home, wealth, and lovely daughters. But when the angels urged him to flee into the mountains, he begged for permission to move into another city. And his rationalization was, "Is it not a little one?" Genesis 19:20. How could he do that? Surely Lot had learned that the cities had almost destroyed him. Since the day he pitched his tent toward Sodom, the family had inched almost imperceptibly toward full involvement with the corrupt society of the inner city. Little by little, the transition was made from borderline neutrality to tongue-in-cheek participation. When Lot pleaded to live in yet another city, he was demonstrating dramatically how gradual compromise can blind the senses and distort the judgment. How many in the modern church have long ago pitched their tent toward Sodom? How many have taken that first easily justified step toward compromise? And how many fellow Christians felt uneasy about it, but had not the courage to raise a warning? Later, what happened? Those desensitized Christians began to defend the progressive drift of lowering standards by the same argument, "Is it not a little one?" Does this not explain how worldliness has crept even into the remnant church? For example, how did the miniskirt abomination become such a familiar sight in Seventh-day Adventist churches on Sabbath morning? Of course, that day is over for the present, but you remember. Listen, Sister White explains how it happened with the hoop skirts in another generation, and you can see how Satan used the same subtlety to introduce the miniskirt. This statement is taken from Testimonies, Volume 1, page 278. The power of example is great. Sister A ventures to wear small hoops. Sister B says, "It's no worse for me to wear hoops than for Sister A," and she wears them a little larger. Sister C imitates the example of Sisters A and B and wears her hoops a little larger than A and B, but all contend that their hoops are small. End quote. Does that sound familiar? Girls and ladies alike in the remnant church began to inch up in their hemlines. If the knee length was all right, then what was wrong with half an inch above the knee? If it was modest at a half inch above, then how could another half inch make it immodest? Why was so little said about it in protest? Because every stage of the leavening process was too small to stir an alarm. Not even the ministry realized what was really taking place. Many dared speak out, but they were quickly silenced by charges of having an evil mind. Very few continued to blow the trumpet of warning against the growing violation of modesty. How can we explain the blanket of silence that often attends these specious intrusions of the world? Apparently much of it is rooted in the fear of offending. Listen to this statement taken from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 2, page 284 and 285. I saw that individuals would rise up against the plain testimonies. It does not suit their natural feelings. They would choose to have smooth things spoken unto them and have peace cried in their ears. I view the church in a more dangerous condition than they've ever been. Experimental religion is known but by a few. The shaking must soon take place to purify the church. Preachers should have no scruples to preach the truth as it's found in God's Word. Let the truth out. I have been shown that why ministers have not been more successful, they are afraid of hurting feelings, fearful of not being courteous, and they lower the standard of truth and conceal, if possible, the peculiarity of our faith. I saw that God could not make such successful. The truth must be made pointed and the necessity of a decision urged. And as false shepherds are crying peace and are preaching smooth things, the servants of God must cry aloud and spare not and leave the result with God. Again, from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 2, pages 283 and 284. By some there is a shunning of the living testimony. Cutting truths must not be shunned. It needs something besides theory to reach hearts now. It needs the stirring testimony to alarm and arouse that will stir the enemy's subjects, and then honest souls will be led to decide for the truth. There has been and still is with some a disposition to have everything move on very smoothly. They see no necessity of straight testimony. Sins exist in the church that God hates, but they're scarcely touched for fear of making enemies. Opposition has risen in the church to plain testimony. Some will not bear it. They wish smooth things spoken unto them. And if the wrongs of individuals are touched, they complain of severity and sympathize with those in the wrong. When the church departs from God, they despise the plain testimony and complain of severity and harshness. It is a sad evidence of the lukewarm state of the church. End quote. Oh, listen, the great need of the church is for courageous ministers who will speak boldly about right and wrong. The pastor who truly loves his flock and his God will not hesitate to call sin by its right name in every discourse. Straightforward